Happy to see you all, and welcome to our visitors. We see several visitors today, so please come and be with us again. So when I'm getting that up here, I wanted to mention Anderson was in the bulletin to do our special music today, but he's not here. But I did get a chance to visit with Anderson and learn something interesting that pertains to Elijah. What Anderson told me, he was going through, and it turns out Anderson was doing like 3 or 4 instruments, something like that. And he told me that Elijah has done just about that many instruments. So he said, he starts this one, and then he starts that one, and then he starts that one. So my word of advice, Elijah, is pick one, and the next time when Anderson's missing, you can step up and do special music for us. Amen. One other thing I wanted to share. So last week I had a prayer request, and I've got a few questions during the week, so I prayed for a smooth job transition. I've accepted a job with the Carolina Conference in Treasury, and so I want to clarify because several people have asked me last week and again today. We are going to be here still through next summer. My wife's still finishing up another year plus at Vanderbilt, so we are sad that us leaving this area is on the horizon, but it's still, we're glad that it's not goodbye right now, so I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so before we start today, let's have one more word. Dear God, we just invite your Spirit to be with us this morning. Help us to have open minds, open hearts, put aside all the stresses of the week, of this world, and just focus on what you have to say. I pray that it would be not my words, but yours, God. So Principles of Prophecy 101 is what our message is called today. And that means the intention is there will be at least a 201. So in a few weeks from now, we will try to build a little bit on what we established today. I want to try to do just some basics in terms of why do we have prophecy, how do we interpret these prophetic things in the Bible, and then maybe we can, again, look to build on that in a few weeks. So to try to stay organized, I have kind of 3 main points that I want to go through today. Number 1, by the way, there is going to be a quiz at the end, so please pay attention because I'm going to ask what your main takeaways were in the end on these areas. So please help me out with that. So number 1, we're going to talk about the purpose of prophecy. Why does God include prophecy in the Bible? Okay. Number 2, let's talk about the types of prophecy. Is it one size fits all? It's prophecy or it's not, or is there a little bit more nuance than that? And then number 3, when we come across these prophetic passages or prophetic books, how do we interpret those? There's some different major schools actually that have totally different approaches of how we look at these prophetic areas in Scripture. So we're going to talk about those and see if we can make the best selection possible there. Okay. So the purpose of prophecy. In Isaiah 46, we read, I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, there's prophecy, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. Okay, so our first point here, the purpose of prophecy. Why does God reveal the end from the beginning? I think he's saying it's to show us that he is the one and only, he is above all, right? There's nobody else that knows the end from the beginning. And also that he will accomplish his will. Sometimes it can seem like this world is spiraling out of control, and it can seem like, from our perspective, does God even know what is going on? But he gives us this prophecy to say, yes, ultimately my purposes will be accomplished. All right, John 14:29 says, and now I have told you before it comes to pass, that when it does come to pass, you may believe. So another reason here that we have prophecy is to build faith in God's word. When we see that something has been predicted and that's been fulfilled in history, it should build our confidence in God's word, should it not? One more here. In 2 Peter we read, and so we have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to heed as a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. The morning star here is, of course, Christ. So another purpose of the prophetic word is actually for Christ to grow in our hearts. When we understand the end from the beginning that he shows us, it should give us a new love and a new appreciation and and wanting a deeper relationship with Christ. Okay, so now let's move to types of prophecy. There's basically two main categories that we can identify when we're looking at prophetic books. And I'm going to explain we're going to look at how we can identify which category we're looking at. But let's talk about some of the main distinctions between the two. So in classical, the two types, by the way, are classical prophecy and apocalyptic prophecy. Those are the two labels. In classical prophecy, we're looking at usually a local or a national situation, okay, for the Bible writer. That's what he's focusing on. Whereas apocalyptic is looking at a universal situation, and it sweeps all the way through history. So this is going to be a key term for us today, a full sweep of history. It's going to start with the day of the prophet and go all the way through history until the time of the end or even the second coming and beyond. Classical prophecy is going to have an emphasis on the contemporary, what's happened right then in that prophet's day and what's coming in the near future. Whereas apocalyptic prophecy is going to have more of a special emphasis on the end times. Classical is going to have very limited symbolism, there may be some, but apocalyptic prophecy is going to have profuse symbolism all throughout it. Classical prophecy normally comes from the word of the Lord tells the prophet writes it down. Apocalyptic prophecy we usually see being given in visions and dreams. Classical prophecy is conditional. We think here, for example, of Jonah. He prophesied that Nineveh was going to be destroyed, and he didn't say, maybe, they may change their ways and then they won't be, but they did change their ways. If you remember, Jonah was actually upset about that. But they changed their ways and they weren't destroyed, and God explains elsewhere, I think it's in Jeremiah, he basically explains, hey, when I forecast or prophesy bad or good toward a nation, that depends on how they respond. If they change their ways, I will relent from my purposes, okay? So that's a conditional prophecy, and that falls under the heading of classical. Whereas apocalyptic, God is saying, this is how it's going to unfold. This is my sovereign will, and this is what's going to happen. There's no dual fulfillment. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Okay, classical prophecy has what I like to call two peaks and no valley. So what I mean by this is it's looking at mostly at the local situation right then, but then it may look a little bit at the very end time. So there could even be a dual fulfillment, something that applies to the prophet's day, something that applies to the very end. But it has no look at the valley in between, just right where they are at the very end. Whereas apocalyptic, again, is going to take us all the way from the prophet's day all the way to the end time. So it shows the whole path along the way. Okay. So under the heading of classical prophecy, here we find the major prophets, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in the Old Testament, and then all of the minor prophets. These are basically books of classical prophecy, or that contain much classical prophecy. In the apocalyptic category, we just had two. We have one in the Old Testament and one in the New, Daniel and Revelation. And we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking about Daniel and Revelation, why they are apocalyptic books, and how we might think about understanding those books. So first, I want to just establish here a little bit how tightly connected the books of Daniel and Revelation are. There's many different exegetical ways we can establish this. When we look at the text of both books, I want to mention just a couple. So in Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision, which is Daniel's first vision he receives in the book, because if you remember, the vision in chapter 2 is actually Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interprets. So Daniel has a vision in chapter 7. You can see the beasts here that Daniel has, and we're told the nations that they represent in most cases. So we have the lion, we have the bear, we have the leopard with 4 heads, and then we have this terrible beast, this dreadful beast with 10 horns. We come to Revelation 13, and we find the sea beast there at the beginning of Revelation 13. And it is an amalgamation, it's a combination of all these beasts that Daniel described in Daniel 7. We find them all up together in Revelation 13. And then we find more description of what this beast is going to do, and another beast, the land beast that comes after it. So here, the point is, Revelation is picking up where Daniel left off, with the beasts that represent these empires and their activities. We see this again one more time in Daniel 12 and Revelation 10. So when we get to Daniel 12, we find a man that's clothed in linen above the river. He raises his hands to heaven, and he swears by him who lives forever and ever, God. Okay? We come to Revelation 10, and we see a very similar description. Here we have an angel that has a foot on the sea and another on the earth. He has a hand raised to heaven also, and then the same language is used. He swore by him who lives forever and ever. I encourage you, by the way, go back after this and read these passages. Don't take my word for it. But you'll see the links there clearly between those two. In Daniel, we end with Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. So there's something in Daniel that's not going to be understood. It's sealed until the time of the end. And so then we have the same angel, same imagery appear in Revelation 10, but this time, notice how it ends. Take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel. So John is told to take this book from the angel which now is open. So what was closed and sealed in Daniel is open in Revelation, and Revelation continues unfolding what was in that book. So again, we have Revelation continuing the story of Daniel. I thought it was interesting, this is just an AI answer or a Google answer about the connection of Daniel and Revelation. I thought it was pretty good. It says, the book of Daniel is the apocalyptic book of the Hebrew Bible. Its sister book would be the book of Revelation. And in fact, the book of Revelation is largely a Christian interpretation of the book of Daniel. So for the most part, I think Google summarizes it decently there. Okay. So Daniel and Revelation as apocalyptic prophecy. Let's go back to talking about what makes these books apocalyptic prophetic books. Well, first of all, the word Revelation is translated from the Greek apocalypsis. So basically where we get our word apocalypse from comes from this Greek word. So Revelation, even by its name, has to do with the apocalypse. Okay? These books we're going to see are highly filled with visions and dreams. That's how God communicates to Daniel and to John in these books, which differs from classical prophecy. There's profuse symbolism throughout them, and they give us a full sweep of history. So, one more, there's an end-time emphasis in these books. So let's take a look at, unpack that a little bit. Visions and dreams in the book of Daniel. It seems like every time we turn around, there's another vision or dream being given in this book. In Daniel chapter 2, Verse 2, now Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. And in chapter 2, of course, this is where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream of the image, which Daniel comes and explains to him. We're going to look at that briefly later. Now Daniel chapter 7. Now this time Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. This is the one of the beasts that we showed in the picture earlier. And then the next chapter, which happens 2 years later, Daniel has another dream. A vision appeared to me, Daniel. This time he's shown the nations with the ram and the goat. We come to Revelation. One example here of John, how Revelation was shown to John. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, and what you see, write in the book. And so John is given this vision here. We see repeatedly in the book of Revelation, John being called up to see things happening out of this world, see things taking place in heaven. This is the nature of how Daniel and Revelation are revealed. Our next point is symbolism. Anybody that has spent time reading the books of Daniel, especially Revelation, are familiar with or acquainted with that there's all kinds of symbolism everywhere you look. We have the image, Nebuchadnezzar's image, in Daniel chapter 2. We have in Daniel 7, the beast that we talked about before. We have this little horn that comes up with speaking pompous words, also in chapter 7 and chapter 8, and then the ram and the goat. In the book of Revelation, this is just a few images. There's so many there. We have Jesus with the sword coming out of his mouth on a white horse. We have a woman clothed with the sun and the moon, with a dragon, with all these heads coming after her. We have all of this rich symbolism in the book of Revelation. In fact, the first verse of the book says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God sent and signified by his angel to his servant John. And so the word signified there tells us right from the very first verse that we should be expecting a lot of signs and symbols in this book. Okay. So far, we've established that we're dealing with the books of Daniel and Revelation filled with visions and dreams and a whole bunch of symbolism. The problem, or the trick with symbolism, is there's many different interpretations. People have different ideas of what these symbols mean. how can we come up with a methodology? What are we going to use to guide us in interpreting these signs and symbols? Well, there's been four major schools of thought around how we would approach these books. Those are historicism, preterism, futurism, and idealism. So let's talk briefly about what these are and make a suggestion of what approach that we think would best fit the biblical data. So historicism, basically what historicism sees is prophecy stretching from the prophet's time. So in John's case, the first century when John was being shown what was going on, all the way to the end of Earth's history, full sweep of history. A key principle we're going to spend a little time on to historicism, we could say it's the lifeblood of historicism, is the year-day principle. So when we're dealing with prophetic sections and we see time periods spoken of in the form of a day, we apply the year-day principle in that interpretation. Many early church leaders used historicism when they looked at biblical prophecy, including Tertullian, Eusebius, and Jerome. There's many others. And the reformers. This was the method of the reformers. Whether it's John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, John Calvin, this is the approach that reformers took to understanding prophecy. Here's a summary quote here. Until the 19th century, historicism was a centuries-old, well-established method of prophetic exposition, but it gave way to both dispensationalist futurism and to the more scholarly preterism. Okay, so until 150 years ago or so, everybody, at least in the Protestant camp, approached things from a historicist point of view. Okay, preterism. What is preterism? Well, it started, or at least became significant during the Counter-Reformation. It can be traced back to the Jesuit scholar Alcazar. And in 1614, he kind of came up with this school of thought. What it does is it focuses on the past. So it takes Daniel and Revelation and it looks at things that happened in the past and says, basically, this is all done. We shouldn't be looking forward to anything else because it was all done. Now there's partial and full preterism. We're not going to get into all that, but that's basically a focus on the past. In the book of Daniel, they see Daniel centering and kind of climaxing around the activities of the Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes. This is, he's identified as the little horn power, spoken of in Daniel 7 and 8. That would take more exposition than what we have today. I would just contend with that it's Daniel 7 and 8 is describing a much bigger shoe than the foot of Antiochus Epiphanes. He's this little, fairly insignificant king. The little horn, on the other hand, waxes exceedingly great and does some amazing things. In the book of Revelation, preterists will see Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero, as being the fulfillment of much of what is spoken of in Revelation. Okay, so futurism. Again, this came out of the Counter-Reformation, again by a Jesuit scholar in 1580. This scholar had the last name de Rivera. All right, and the idea here, as the name implies, is a focus not on the past, not on a full sweep of history. It's a focus on the future and the Antichrist. And this has become popular in evangelical Christianity today. There's a series, I guess it's a little bit older now when I was a kid, Left Behind, and this uses a lot of this theology. So this is popular in evangelical schools of thought today. There's a focus especially on the last 7 years of Earth's history. And what this does, we'll look at it a little bit more. What it does, there's the 70-week prophecy of Daniel 9. It takes that last week, the 7 days, and it implies that it puts them way into the future sometime. Okay, idealism. One more. This one, school of thought, I think is becoming more popular. And actually what it says is all the signs and symbols in Daniel and Revelation, they really don't have any historical fulfillments and they don't point to any future predictions. The reason for those symbols are simply so that we can get spiritual lessons. So we shouldn't be looking for historical or future fulfillments there. So what really differentiates these methods? We could get into different things, but a key item that differentiates these methods is the year-day principle. Dr. Davidson, for example, says the year-day principle is the basic diagnostic difference between historicism and the other schools of interpretation. So the year-day principle, very central to the historicist school of thought. And I want to use, there's a lot of good support for the year-day principle. A lot of it comes from within Daniel and Revelation, within the text itself. There are a couple of verses where we can see this precedent in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 4:6 says, I have given you a day for a year, and Numbers 14:34, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year. Again, if you go through Daniel 8, for example, there's a lot of reasons in that passage that we have to apply a day for a year or it doesn't make sense. But what I want to spend our time on today is what I think is maybe the best argument for the year-day principle. I want to work through an example of the 70-week prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. And the reason I think this is a great case for the year-day principle and in turn historicism is because it works. If we apply the year-day principle to the 70-week prophecy in Daniel 9, it works with the historical events. So let's walk through that. Okay, so this is part of Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. If you want to turn there, feel free. I'll have portions of the verses up on the screen as we go along. 70 weeks are determined for your people. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And I cut out a lot of the passage in there, but it's still a mouthful, so we're going to break it down a little bit. Okay? Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined for your people. So again, we're going to see how the year-day principle works here. 70 weeks times 7 days a week, mathematicians here, 490 years, okay? So if we're using the year-day principle, when we have 70 weeks, we're going to have a period of 490 years. All right, now Daniel 9:25. From the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So let's start filling out our 70 weeks here. So we have from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, that's our starting point, until Messiah the Prince. There shall be 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, so we come up with 69 weeks. If we take 7 days per week, 69 times 7, comes out to 483. So at this point, we could say from the decree to rebuild to Messiah the Prince, we would expect 483 literal years. Okay? So our next question is, when was that command given? When was the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? Well, there were 3 decrees. Some argue for a 4th, but it really wasn't a decree. There were 3 actual decrees issued by Persian kings during the Hebrew exile that could be potentially considered here. All right. Cyrus issued a decree related to rebuilding Jerusalem in 538 BC. Darius gave another in 520, and then Artaxerxes gave a third in 457 BC. Well, the first 2 of these decrees, the Cyrus and Darius decrees, they only related to the temple, not the city. So there was not a restoring and a rebuilding. If you look at those words, and there's in-depth studies on those, there needs to be a restoration of the Jewish economy, not just a restoration of their temple. And the first 2 decrees here were quite limited in their scope. They applied to the temple only, not to the city. Okay, so that leaves us with Artaxerxes' decree in 457 BC. So let's test that one out. Artaxerxes' decree. Well, that decree, if you want to read about it, it's described in Ezra 7, verses 12 to 26. What it includes in there that the previous decrees did not was that priests could return to Jerusalem and there could be an establishment of Jewish courts of law. They could go back to governing things the way that they do according to Jewish law. The wall rebuilding, so the rebuilding component was also here because we can see, if you go read about it in Ezra 4, 11 to 16, the wall rebuilding was also affected by this decree. So this decree matches very well. This was the restore and rebuilding. This is 457 BC. How can we know that date? Well, we know from Ezra 7 as well that this decree happened in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign. The good thing for us, history has well established now, when his reign began so we can figure out when that took place. We have astronomical sources, but we also have historical sources, Jewish, Egyptian, and Persian, that all confirm beyond any reasonable doubt that when Artaxerxes' reign began, and 7 years into his reign, therefore, was 457 BC, and that's when he gave this decree. So we use this date, 457 BC, and I want to go back to this verse just once more so we don't get lost. From the going forth of that command, 457 BC, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So far we have this 483-year period between the decree to rebuild and Messiah the Prince. 69 times 7 is 483. The event at the end of this, Messiah the Prince, the name Messiah means the anointed one. Jesus became anointed for beginning his ministry, set apart for beginning his ministry when he was baptized. And that occurred in the fall of the year AD 27. So, what we can say from 457 BC, we move ahead 483 years, we come to AD 27. And sure enough, we have Messiah the Prince, the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We move to the final piece of this prophecy in Daniel 9:27. Then Messiah the Prince shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So I have a question for you. What event in the life of Jesus, Messiah the Prince, what event was it that brought an end to the need for sacrifice and offering? It was a cross, right? It was when Jesus died on the cross, there was no more need for earthly sacrifice and offering. The veil was torn in the earthly temple. So here we have this kind of laid out. We've already talked about the 483 years that bring us from 457 to AD 27. And here's where we have an interesting difference with futurism that we talked about. So futurism is going to take this last week of Daniel 9:27 that we just read about. It's going to take that and put it out someplace way into the future. However, there's no textual reason to do this. If you read it, there's no indication in the text that there would be any break in this time period. So, AD 27, the baptism of Jesus, and we have in the middle of the week, if we have a week being 7 years, the middle, of course, is 3.5 years. So from the fall of AD 27, 3.5 years takes us to the spring of AD 31. And that is, in fact, when Jesus died on the cross in the spring of AD 31, causing sacrifice to cease. The very final piece of this prophecy, which is in our focus today, deals with another 3.5 years passing, the stoning of Stephen in AD 34. And that ultimately sealed Israel's fate. They were no longer God's chosen nation. Paul, of course, was at the stoning of Stephen. He became the one that took the gospel to the Gentiles. Interesting, related to this, if you have the 70 weeks in total, it's 490 years. If you remember Jesus when he was asked how many times should we forgive, he said 70 times 7. And some people, and I thought for a long time, it just means forgive a lot of times, don't count. Well, it actually comes to 490, but just like he gave this 490-year prophecy, which was the chance for the Jews. In other words, he was very long with the Jews for 490 years. They ultimately sealed rejection of him, though. Okay, so recap on the schools of prophetic interpretation. Historicism goes all the way back to the early church. It focuses on a full sweep of history, and it sees prophecy as being fulfilled throughout history. Preterism finds its roots in 1614. It focuses on past fulfillments. And in terms of its view of prophecy, it kind of has to accept that there's been some failures or at least delays in the fulfillment of prophecy. When we come to futurism, we find a lot of similarities. It also came out of the Counter-Reformation in 1580, but it focuses on future fulfillments. And again, it does have to acknowledge, based on what the prophets said in their day, there has been some failures or at least delays in the fulfillment of prophecy. Idealism originated in the medieval period, and its focus is on non-literal. We don't have literal fulfillments for these symbols, and there's no predictive prophecy involved here. Okay, So we have made the case. We've looked at the year-day principle, which is the lifeblood of historicism. If you look through these books, and I encourage you to do so, and we'll probably do more in our part 2, historicism best matches the flow of the biblical data. So let's look a little bit more at that. Daniel and Revelation, remember, we're talking about why these books are apocalyptic prophecy. We've talked about that they're full of visions and dreams. We've talked about the profuse symbolism in the books. A couple more points we want to cover. I want to show that these books give a full sweep of history, and also that there's an emphasis on the end times. So for the full sweep of history piece, in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar sees this image, which Daniel comes and interprets, we find out through the rest of Daniel what nations these are, all the way down to Greece. But what is told to us is that Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. But then there's going to be another nation. It's going to be silver. It's going to be Medo-Persia. There's going to be another nation. It's going to be bronze. It's going to be Greece. And then we have iron in Rome, representing Rome, and then we have iron and clay in the divided Europe. And of course, at the end of this comes this big stone cut without human hands. It's a supernatural stone, destroys the image, and this kingdom is set up forever, which of course is God's kingdom. So I think we can see very clearly just in Daniel 2, this is not a book that's looking just at a local situation that was fulfilled all in the past. It's taking us all the way down through history in these nations, which have come to pass just as prophesied, all the way to the second coming. And this vision is only repeated. There's more details in Daniel 7, 8, and 11. So we have a full sweep of history clearly seen in Daniel 2. In the book of Revelation, Revelation 1:19 says, "Write the things which you have seen," and notice this, "and the things which are," so that would be contemporary, what's happening right in John's time, "and the things which will take place after this." So again, John's writing about first century stuff, but he's going to also write about things that take place after this. In the first half of Revelation, we have 3 sequences of 7 where John does just that. There's the 7 churches, 7 seals, and 7 trumpets. These are just different eras of the history of the church and the world, a little bit different perspective, but they clearly take us from John's day down to the end of time. And then we even get a look behind the scenes at the great controversy, the history and the battle between God and Satan right in the middle of Revelation. Okay, so and as far as an end time emphasis, in the book of Daniel, there's 4 main visions in the book of Daniel, chapters 2, 7, 8, and 11. Chapter 2, we have the vision of the image. The climax of that vision, the high point, the end, is the second coming of Jesus. In chapter 7, we have this vision of the beast, the lion, the bear, leopard, the terrible beast. The end of that vision is judgment in heaven, which we know we're not covering today. That began in 1844. And so that focuses on the last days of Earth's history as well. Chapter 8, when we have the ram and goat and the little horn, we're talking about the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, again, the last days of Earth's history. Chapter 11, we have the kings of the north and south, and that climaxes again with the second coming. So Daniel is pointing us again and talking much about the end times. He sweeps through history, but he focuses on the end time. In fact, Daniel 12 ends with, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end," because there's special messages in there for the time of the end. And we talked about this, where Daniel 12 leaves off, Revelation 10 picks up. The book is sealed in Daniel 12, it's open in Revelation chapter 10. And so if Daniel is focusing on end times, Revelation is even more so, because the whole second half of Revelation, we look at Revelation structure. The first 12 chapters have mostly to do with history, but beyond that, the second part of Revelation, it deals with the end times and the second coming. So once that little book is open in Revelation chapter 10, most of the rest of Revelation deals with the end times. So we see here again the sweep of history with a spotlight on the end times. Okay, so that brings us through the main portion here, and so now is the promise quiz. So we'll see who has some info here. So the purpose of prophecy, what are some thoughts? What are some main reasons that God gave us prophecy?
God can fulfill His will, and so we can believe.
God fulfills His will, and so we can believe. So we see God being above all, and we see that even though it can seem like things are spiraling out of control, we can see past fulfillment, so we can see that God is going to have future fulfillments. He's going to come again, just like He said He was. Yeah, that's great. Anything else? Some other reasons for prophecy? Yes.
Help us use discernment.
Say it again.
To help us with discernment.
Help us with discernment, sure. As we see the things going on around us, yeah. Okay, good answer. So the three simple ones that I put to summarize: give us confidence in God's word, show us context of where we're living in terms of Earth's history, and to show us Christ, to reveal Christ to us. Of course, Revelation starts off and tells us it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, so the types of prophecy. What are the two main types of prophecy? Yep, very good. Classical and apocalyptic. Classical, including the minor prophets and even some of the major ones of the Old Testament. And then apocalyptic, you have Daniel, the Old Testament, and we talked about how tightly connected that is with Revelation in the New. Okay, so when we get to these apocalyptic books that are full of dreams and symbols, there are some different schools of interpretation in terms of approaching those books. What are the schools, the major schools of interpretation? Okay, I think I'm hearing them. I think I'm hearing them all. So we have preterism. This is more the scholarly approach. This is what most scholars take. It focuses on past fulfillments, especially Antiochus Epiphanes and Nero, come into view here. We have the futurist perspective. This is the popular evangelical view, incorporating the rapture theory, usually in the time of tribulation. This focuses on future fulfillment of prophecy, especially the last 7 years of Earth's history. You have idealism, which says, no, there's no fulfillment even to be found here. It's all just metaphors for our spiritual enrichment. All right, and then you have historicism, which is the view that I prefer as the best one that matches with the biblical and historical data. It's the view that Seventh-day Adventists take in understanding prophecy. This is where we look at a full sweep of history from the prophet's day all the way to the end of time. Key difference in historicism is the year-day principle. This sets it apart from any of the other schools. Okay, very good. You guys did great on the quiz. So I want to leave you with a couple of things here, a little bit of an appeal. I just want to say, we see time and time again, we are in Earth's last days. We don't know how, our timing is not God's. We don't know what will usher in last events, but we can see from fulfilled prophecy that time is short. We also know that God knows the end from the beginning. And we're living for such a time as this. God could have had you and I live at any other point of Earth's history, but He has us living now at the focal point, the climax. Daniel, Revelation point to this time period right before His coming. And so I think that we should think of it as such a time as this. Ask God, what does He have for us to do? How can we be used by Him just before His second coming? And knowing Him, knowing God, and His purpose for us means knowing His Word. So we have to dedicate ourselves like never before to studying His Word, and especially prophecy, because prophecy is pointing to the very time period that we're living in right now. So let's spend maybe a renewed, or if it's your first time, let's spend some energy, some time, dedicated time in the books of Daniel and Revelation, and asking, God, what are you showing me in these books? I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts here. When the books of Daniel and Revelation are better understood, believers will have an entirely different religious experience. They will be given such glimpses of the open gates of heaven that heart and mind will be impressed with the character that all must develop in order to realize the blessedness which is to be the reward of the pure in heart. When we start to see these pictures of heaven unfolding before us in the books of Daniel and Revelation, it does. It stirs up a joy in our heart where we're just like, God, you are incredible. What else do you have to show me here? And then John himself, he says it this way at the beginning of Revelation. Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written in it. Let's not just be hearers of the word, but let's be doers. Right? That's what James here. That's what James said. John is saying here, for the time is near. And indeed, the time is near. So I want us to keep this in mind. I hope that we have a little bit of a framework here, and I hope that we can reconvene in a few weeks and continue building on what we have. So let's have our closing song.